Life had begun to settle into a rhythm, and she felt herself relaxing into her new home. The boxes were mostly unpacked, the furniture arranged just the way she liked it. And her small garden was beginning to bloom, filling the air with a delicate fragrance. It was the kind of peace she had longed for, in most days. She felt genuinely happy for the first time in a long while. Her neighbor remained a steady presence. He still tended to his yard with the same care. Still appeared occasionally with helpful suggestions or small gifts, a bag of fresh tomatoes from his garden, a hand-drawn diagram showing the best way to plant her flowers, a cup of coffee on a particularly busy morning. Every interaction felt small, harmless, and kind. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. It started with little requests. One morning, as she watered her garden, he appeared, holding a small packet of fertilizer. "I have a bit extra," he said. "Do you want some for your plants?" She shook her head politely. "No, thank you. I think I have enough for now." He nodded, but there was a hint of insistence in his tone. "Are you sure?" "It would be no trouble at all. I don't want it to go to waste." She hesitated for a moment. It felt strange to refuse, even though she didn't need it. "Okay, I guess a little won't hurt." He smiled, and she noticed again how easily he made her feel like she was being unreasonable for saying no. It was subtle, a soft push, rather than a demand. And she didn't think much of it at the time. The requests grew slowly, almost naturally. He asked her to check on his mailbox while he was out of town, to water a few more plants, to pick up a package that had been delivered to the wrong address. Each favor seemed small and harmless. Each time she felt like saying no might make her appear unkind. Each time she gave in, feeling helpful and needed. At first she told herself it was normal neighborly behavior. Helping each other out was part of living in a community, wasn't it? She enjoyed being useful. She liked the feeling that she was making someone's day easier. But the little favors started adding up. He would casually mention that he needed help with things she hadn't even noticed, moving a heavy box from his garage, cleaning a small patch of weeds along the sidewalk, carrying a chair to his backyard. Every time it was framed as a casual request. Not an obligation, but she noticed that he seemed to expect her help more often than she realized. One afternoon, she was sorting through laundry on her porch when he appeared with a stack of newspapers under his arm. "Would you mind holding these for a minute?" "I need to grab something from the garage," he asked. She barely had time to respond before he was gone, leaving her with the bundle. It wasn't heavy, but it was enough to pull her away from what she was doing. It's enough to make her pause and think, "I guess this is normal. He's just asking for help." Yet that day, a small seed of doubt planted itself. She noticed the way he watched her, his eyes lingering just a moment too long. It wasn't frightening, not yet, but there was a weight to it, like he was quietly observing, making sure she was doing exactly what he expected. She shook the thought away. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was just overthinking. Over the next week, the subtle tension grew. He would appear unannounced, standing at the edge of her yard with a suggestion, a question, or a task. Sometimes it was a casual invitation to help him fix something, sometimes a question about her day. Always polite, always calm, always insistent enough to make her hesitate before saying no. One evening, she was painting the railing of her porch. The brush dipped carefully into the white paint, and she worked slowly, trying to get the edges clean. Suddenly, she felt a presence behind her. "I can help with that," he said. Startled, she turned. "Oh, you don't have to. I just thought it might be easier if I held the railing while you painted," he said, stepping closer. She nodded, a little flustered. His gesture seemed helpful, but she realized she felt a flicker of discomfort. He didn't overstep in a way that was obvious, but he was there, close, quietly guiding what she was doing. By the time the railing was painted, it looked perfect, of course. She thanked him, but the unease lingered. That night, she found herself replaying the moment in her head. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a quiet awareness that she didn't remember feeling so closely observed by anyone before. It wasn't a bad feeling, just strange. As the days passed, she noticed it more. He began asking questions about her schedule, casually mentioning things like, "I didn't see you outside this morning." Did you have plans? Or I thought you'd be home around this time? I hope I'm not interrupting anything." At first it seemed like harmless curiosity, but over time she realized he knew when she would be home, when she would step outside, sometimes even what she was doing. One afternoon, as she arranged her garden, she overheard him speaking on the phone to someone in a hushed voice, saying something about checking on her today. The words were vague, but the implication made her pause. She felt a small knot form in her stomach. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe he was just talking about the plants or the house. But the unease refused to leave. She tried to ignore it. After all, he had been kind, helpful, friendly. She had welcomed his assistance and enjoyed his company. Surely she was reading too much into it? She continued to help him when asked, watered his plants, carried his packages, and shared small moments of conversation. She laughed at his jokes, admired his garden, and even began to look forward to the afternoons when he would appear, believing she was safe in the routine. But then came the small, subtle hints that made her question everything. One day, she was heading out to the corner store when he appeared at the gate, blocking the path. "Going somewhere?" he asked casually. "Yes, just to get a few things," she replied. "Oh, I can come with you," he said, smiling. "It'll be nice to get some fresh air together." She hesitated. Something about the offer didn't feel right, but she didn't want to offend him. "No, that's okay. I just need a few minutes." He tilted his head slightly, his smile unwavering. "Are you sure? It's just a short walk. I don't want you to carry everything alone." She nodded quickly. "I'm sure, really." He stepped aside, allowing her to pass. But she couldn't shake the feeling that he had been subtly testing her, seeing how she would respond. She laughed it off, blaming her own nerves. But the thought lingered. Over the next few weeks, she noticed more small behaviors that felt off. He would casually comment on things she had done inside her house, how she had arranged her furniture, how she had cleaned a particular corner, even what she had been wearing on certain days. Always polite, always seemingly innocent, but it left her with a sense that he was paying more attention than was necessary. It became clear that his niceness was no longer just friendly gestures. It was carefully measured attention, a way of observing her routines, learning her habits, and slowly creating a web of familiarity that made it difficult to say no. She realized that she had unwittingly allowed him into her life, trusting him because he had been helpful and kind, and yet she still told herself it was nothing. She kept finding excuses, thinking that perhaps she was overreacting. Maybe people could be this attentive without ulterior motives. Maybe she was imagining things. But the little things kept happening, building a pattern that was impossible to ignore. A bag of groceries left at her door when she hadn't mentioned needing help. A note on her windshield reminding her of something she had said in passing. A casual question about her plans for the weekend that seemed too precise. Each act alone seemed innocent, but together, they painted a picture she couldn't quite explain. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, she noticed him standing quietly across the street. Watching her from his porch, she froze, unsure if he had seen her notice him. He smiled and she waved back. But the small chill in her chest remained. She went back to her kitchen, trying to ignore it. But the feeling of being observed lingered long after. By the end of part 2, she was caught in a strange balance. She still appreciated his help, still enjoyed his company. But the subtle hints of control and observation were becoming impossible to ignore. The friendly neighbor she had welcomed into her life was slowly revealing a side that made her uneasy. A side that suggested his niceness might not be entirely innocent. She had not yet realized how far it would go, or what steps she would need to take to protect herself. But the foundation was being laid, brick by brick, in the quiet, polite gestures and small favors that once seemed harmless. And soon she would be faced with the first undeniable sign that the calm, friendly routine she had cherished was about to change in a way she could never have predicted. The morning started like any other. Sunlight poured into the small kitchen, casting long shadows across the counter where she had left her half-empty coffee cup. The aroma of brewed coffee was comforting, and for a moment, she allowed herself to think it would be a normal, peaceful day. She stepped outside to water her small garden. The flowers were beginning to bloom fully, their colors vibrant against the neat rows she had carefully planted. Her neighbor was nowhere in sight, which was unusual, and for a brief moment, she felt a small relief. Perhaps today would be just about her, without any unsolicited interruptions or subtle requests. As she approached the side of the house, her eyes widened in shock. A large, imposing structure had appeared overnight, cutting through the side of her yard. A 6-foot wooden fence now ran along the property line, perfectly straight, freshly painted, and impossibly high. It blocked her view of the rest of the street, the sidewalk, and even the smaller trees that once separated her yard from the neighbors. She blinked, unsure if she was seeing correctly. The fence had been built silently, without any warning, without a word of explanation. It wasn't a small boundary fence or something temporary. It was deliberate, permanent, and entirely unexpected. Her stomach twisted, and a wave of unease washed over her almost immediately as she noticed him standing at the gate of his side of the yard. His posture was calm, relaxed, almost casual, as if nothing had happened. His eyes met hers, and he smiled, a small, polite curve of his lips that did nothing to ease the tension gnawing at her chest. "Good morning," said his voice, calm and even. "I hope I'm not startling you. You've built this overnight?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, not out of fear, but from a mix of shock and disbelief. "Yes," he replied simply. "I thought it would be best for both of us." She narrowed her eyes. "Best for both of us? I didn't even know this was happening. Why would you just put up a 6-foot fence without asking me?" He tilted his head, maintaining that same calm, polite demeanor. "I figured it would give you more privacy. You've been outside a lot, and I thought it might be nice to have a bit of separation from the street. Sometimes people feel exposed when their yard is open. This way, you can enjoy your space without interruptions." Her hands clenched at her sides. "Interruptions? You mean like showing up unannounced, asking me to do things for you, and watching everything I do?" He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I was only trying to help. You seemed to enjoy the little favors. I thought this fence would be another way of being considerate." She stepped back, taking in the enormity of the fence. It wasn't just about the physical barrier. It was the message it carried. It was control disguised as concern, dominance hidden behind the mask of helpfulness. She had welcomed his gestures, laughed at his jokes, allowed him into her life in small ways. And now she realized that those small pieces of trust had been used to set boundaries without her consent. "I can't believe you did this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This isn't something you get to decide on your own. It's my yard, too." He nodded slowly. "I understand. But I thought it would make things simpler. Fewer distractions. You can still enjoy your garden without feeling watched." She shook her head. "Watched? You think I'm being watched because of a fence you put up?" He shrugged casually. "I just thought it would be better for both of us. I didn't mean to upset you." Upset didn't begin to cover it. She felt trapped in her own home, confined by this sudden, towering fence. It wasn't just wood. It was a boundary, a silent assertion that he had decided what was best, without discussion, without permission. The realization made her stomach churn. For weeks she had believed in his kindness, welcomed his assistance, laughed at his stories. And now she saw a different side that quietly disregarded her autonomy. She turned away from the fence, trying to collect her thoughts. Her garden, once a place of peace and pride, now felt like a cage, surrounded by walls she hadn't asked for. She felt anger rising, but also fear subtle. Creeping fear that maybe his helpfulness wasn't as innocent as it had seemed. Over the next few days, she tried to speak with him again, hoping there had been some misunderstanding. She asked why he hadn't mentioned the fence before building it, why he thought it was okay to make such a big decision without consulting her. His answers were calm, polite, and frustratingly rational. "I just thought it would save time," he said. "Sometimes it's better to act than to discuss endlessly. You seemed pleased with the little things I've done for you before. I thought this would be the same." She realized he genuinely didn't see it as wrong. To him, the fence was a gesture of care, a way to create order, to prevent problems before they arose. And yet, to her it felt like a violation, a manipulation of the trust she had offered so freely. She tried to adjust. She moved her chairs, changed the layout of her small porch, tried to find the silver lining. Maybe the fence would block the street noise. Maybe it would give her some privacy. But the unease never left. Every glance at the tall, unyielding boards reminded her that her autonomy had been overlooked, that her neighbor's definition of helpful had boundaries that didn't include her consent. One afternoon, she noticed him inspecting the fence closely, checking the alignment of the boards, brushing his hand over the fresh paint. "It looks perfect," he said, glancing at her. "I'm glad you're okay with it." She froze. "Okay with it?" she repeated, incredulous. "I wasn't asked if I was okay with it." He tilted his head, still smiling. "I thought you would appreciate it. You've seemed to enjoy the little things I've done." "I just assumed." "Assumed?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "You assumed you could change my yard without asking me?" He held up his hands, still calm, still polite. "I didn't mean to upset you. I only wanted to help. I thought it would make life easier, but it didn't feel easier. It felt suffocating." Her home, once a place of peace and comfort, now carried the shadow of someone else's control. She felt like a guest in her own yard, observed from the other side of the fence, her routines quietly catalogued and judged. That evening, she spoke with a friend about what had happened. She described the fence, his calm explanations, the way he had positioned the entire situation as a gesture of care. Her friend listened carefully, then said, "It sounds like he's crossing boundaries. Small favors are one thing, but this is different. You need to be firm about your space and your decisions." Her heart sank. She had always prided herself on being polite, on maintaining peace with her neighbors, but now she realized that politeness alone wasn't enough. She needed to set boundaries, assert herself, take back control of her own property. The next day, she tried to speak with him again. This time, she stood at the edge of her yard, looking directly at him across the fence. "We need to talk about this," she said, her voice steady. He nodded. "Of course. I'm happy to listen." "I appreciate your help over the past few weeks," she began, choosing her words carefully. "But this fence. You can't just decide something like this for me. My yard is my space. I need to be involved in these decisions." He tilted his head, considering her words. "I understand," he said slowly. "I truly meant it as a favor. I didn't think it would upset you." "It does upset me," she said firmly. "It makes me feel watched, controlled. I didn't agree to it, and that matters." He remained silent for a moment, then nodded again. "I see. I apologize. That wasn't my intention. I only wanted to help." Even as he spoke, she could feel the lingering tension, the subtle message beneath his calm voice that he believed he knew better, that his definition of helpfulness justified the fence. She realized that the path to reclaiming her space wouldn't be easy. Over the next few days, she began documenting everything. She took photos of the fence, notes of their conversations, small details about the construction. She started researching property lines, neighborhood rules, and legal options. The situation had shifted from a minor annoyance to something more serious. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Yet even as she took these steps, the neighbor continued to appear in small, seemingly harmless ways, watering plants, adjusting something in his yard, offering tips. Each act reminded her of the duality of the situation. A man who could be friendly, helpful, and calm, but also capable of imposing boundaries without consent. By the end of part 3, she understood the reality. Her trust had been tested, and the friendly routine she had once cherished had been disrupted in a way that left her uneasy and cautious. The fence was more than wood and nails. It was a symbol of control, a silent assertion of authority disguised as kindness. And she knew that if she didn't act, the next steps could escalate in ways she wasn't prepared for. The garden still bloomed. The sun still rose and life continued, but a shadow had fallen over her yard. A reminder that appearances could be deceiving, and that trust, once given, could be manipulated in ways she never imagined. She stood on the porch one evening, looking at the fence, feeling the weight of what had happened, and realizing that the path ahead would require courage, clarity, and a willingness to confront the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. After the fence appeared, her sense of comfort in her own home began to erode. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Each time she stepped outside, the 6-foot barrier reminded her of the way her neighbor had imposed his will without asking. What had begun as subtle discomfort had grown into a quiet, persistent anxiety that clung to her, even inside her own walls. She tried to maintain her usual routines, watering her garden, arranging flowers, tending to her small vegetable patch. These were her moments of peace. But now, even these small pleasures carried a shadow. Every glance toward the fence, every movement she made in the yard, reminded her that someone had quietly overstepped her boundaries. One morning, she decided it was time to take action. She couldn't rely on polite conversations alone. The fence had been built, the line had been drawn, and she needed to assert her rights. She gathered her notes, her photographs, and began to research local property laws. She discovered that there were specific regulations regarding the construction of fences and property boundaries. If the fence had been built without her permission or in violation of any rules, she had legal recourse. The next step was difficult. She had to confront her neighbor again, but this time with purpose and clarity. She couldn't let politeness or fear of conflict stop her. That afternoon, she stepped outside, holding her notes and photographs, and approached the fence. "I need to talk to you about this fence," she said firmly, her voice steady. He appeared almost immediately, as if he had been waiting. His posture was casual, calm, yet there was a subtle tension in the way he stood. "Of course," he said, smiling politely. "I've looked into this," she began, "and I want to understand why it was built here without any discussion. I value our neighborly relationship, but this crosses a line. It isn't just about the fence, it's about my space, my decisions, my home." He listened quietly, nodding, his expression unreadable. "I thought I was helping," he said softly. "I didn't think it would bother you so much. I only wanted to make things easier." She shook her head. "Easier for you, maybe, but not for me. You assumed you knew what I wanted, and that isn't okay. I need to have a say in my own property." For a moment, he was silent. Then he said, almost casually, "I understand. I didn't intend to hurt you. Perhaps I misjudged." She studied him carefully. There was sincerity in his tone, but she had learned over the past weeks that appearances could be deceptive. Politeness and calmness could hide manipulation. She realized that she couldn't simply accept his words at face value. She needed to establish boundaries that were firm, undeniable, and enforceable. Over the next few days, she began to implement small measures to reclaim her sense of autonomy. She rearranged her garden to create a space that felt private and secure, away from the fence. She added potted plants and small shrubs along the edge, creating a natural barrier that gave her some comfort. Each plant she placed was a small act of reclaiming control, a silent declaration that this was her space, and she had the right to make decisions about it. Meanwhile, she continued to document everything. Every interaction, every unsolicited appearance, every note or message from him went into a folder she kept carefully. She realized that if things escalated further, having evidence would be essential. Despite her careful planning, the neighbor's behavior continued in subtle ways. He would leave small items near the fence: a bag of compost, a watering can, even a folded chair. Each act was framed as helpful, polite, innocent, but she could feel the underlying assertion of control. It wasn't just that he wanted to be helpful. It was that he wanted to be involved in every small detail of her life, often without asking. One afternoon, she stepped outside to find him adjusting a small solar light she had placed along the edge of the garden. "I thought this would look better if it were angled slightly," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She felt a surge of frustration. "I like it the way it is," she said firmly. "Please don't move things in my yard without asking me." Paused, tilting his head, studying her reaction. "I only wanted to improve it," he said softly. "I didn't think it mattered that you preferred it differently." "It matters to me," she said, her voice steady. My preferences matter. My decisions matter. Please respect that." For a moment, he seemed surprised. Then he nodded. "I understand," he said, but there was a subtle stiffness in his posture now, quiet tension that had not been there before. That evening, she reflected on the encounter. She realized that asserting herself was exhausting. It required constant vigilance, careful wording, and unwavering firmness. But she also recognized that it was necessary. She could no longer rely on politeness or assumptions about goodwill. She had to protect her boundaries actively. Over the next week, she took further steps. She contacted a neighborhood association to understand the rules about fence construction, property boundaries, and mediation options. She also spoke with a local lawyer to discuss her rights and the possible steps if the situation escalated. Each call, each conversation, added clarity to her options, and slowly, a sense of empowerment began to replace the fear that had crept in after the fence appeared. Even as she took these steps, she noticed that the neighbor's behavior continued to subtly test her. He would appear unexpectedly, ask small questions about her day, offer minor favors, and watch her carefully as she worked in her garden. Each act was polite on the surface, but underneath it carried the weight of control, subtle reminder that he had inserted himself into her routines. She began to see the pattern clearly. His niceness was no longer just friendly gestures. It was a careful monitoring of her actions, a slow encroachment on her autonomy. The fence was only the most visible symbol, but every small act, every unsolicited offer, every casual question was part of the same pattern. One afternoon, she decided to confront him more directly. She stepped outside, holding a folder of notes and photographs. "We need to set clear boundaries," she said, her voice firm. "This fence, the small favors, the appearances, I need to make it clear that these things are not acceptable without my consent. I value our neighborly relationship, but it must be based on respect." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "I didn't realize I was overstepping. I only meant to help." She looked at him carefully, noticing the calmness in his demeanor, but also the faint tension behind it. She realized that while he acknowledged her words, the underlying behavior might not change unless she reinforced it consistently. Over the next few days, she began to assert herself more actively. She declined favors that she didn't need, reminded him politely but firmly not to interfere in her yard, and kept careful records of all interactions. Each act of assertion was small, but together they began to create a boundary that he could no longer ignore. At the same time, she focused on reclaiming her sense of peace. She rearranged her garden, added privacy screens, and created a small seating area where she could enjoy her yard without feeling observed. She spent more time inside, reading, cooking, and tending to her indoor plants, creating pockets of safety and comfort away from the fence and its silent implications. Despite the challenges, she found strength in her actions. Every boundary she set, every polite but firm refusal, every small step to reclaim her space reinforced her autonomy. She began to feel a sense of empowerment that had been missing for weeks, a reminder that she could protect herself and her home even in the face of subtle control. One evening, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, she reflected on the past weeks. The neighbor, once a source of comfort and friendliness, had revealed a side that was controlling, subtle, and insistent. But she had also discovered her own strength, her ability to assert herself, to set boundaries, and to reclaim her space. She realized that the situation was far from over. The fence remained, a constant reminder of the tension between polite gestures and control. But she no longer felt powerless. She had taken steps to understand her rights, to document interactions, and to establish boundaries that were clear and firm. By the end of Part 4, she had shifted from a position of passive unease to active vigilance. She knew the neighbor's niceness had limits. She understood that maintaining her autonomy required constant attention and courage. She had begun to navigate the delicate balance of politeness, assertiveness, and protection, preparing herself for the final confrontation that would ultimately restore her sense of safety and independence. The garden still bloomed. The sun still rose, and the days continued. But she now faced them with awareness and determination. She understood that trust, once broken or manipulated, could be rebuilt only with clarity, firmness, and unwavering attention to boundaries. And though the fence remained, she had learned that her voice, her choices, and her space mattered more than the polite assertions of another. The days following her decision to assert boundaries were tense, but she felt a growing sense of control over her life. For weeks she had been cautious, polite yet firm, documenting every interaction, setting rules about her property, and gradually reclaiming her space. Each step had been small, but deliberate. She knew the fence was more than wood. It was a symbol of control, and she intended to confront that head-on. Early one morning she made a plan. She would not leave her home feeling uncertain or uneasy anymore. She gathered her notes, photographs, and copies of the neighborhood regulations she had carefully studied. Each piece of paper represented clarity, proof, and confidence. She would speak to her neighbor calmly but firmly. Making it clear that her home and decisions were hers alone, she stepped outside, holding her folder tightly, and saw him tending to his garden, pruning the bushes along the edge. He looked up as she approached, smiling politely, as he always did. But she had changed. She felt a steady determination in her chest, a certainty that she would no longer be swayed by his calm demeanor or his carefully framed gestures. "We need to talk." He put down his pruners and nodded. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She took a deep breath. "The fence you built without my permission, the constant small favors. The way you've involved yourself in my life, I need to make it clear that these things are not acceptable. I've tried to handle this politely, but it has gone too far. My space, my decisions, my home, these are mine. Do you understand?" For a moment, he studied her face. There was no anger, no overt hostility, just that same calm, polite demeanor. But she noticed a flicker in his eyes, subtle awareness that his assumptions were no longer going to go unchallenged. "I understand," he said slowly. "I truly meant to help. I thought you appreciated it." "I did not agree to it," she replied firmly. "Appreciation does not equal consent. You cannot decide for me what is best for my property or my life. I expect you to respect that from now on." He nodded again, more slowly this time, as if the weight of her words was sinking in. She realized that her confidence, clarity, and preparation were her strongest tools. Politeness alone would not have been enough. Assertiveness, backed with knowledge of her rights, was what made her position unshakable. After that conversation, she began taking further practical steps. She contacted the local authorities responsible for property disputes and requested an inspection of the fence. They measured the boundary lines, compared property records, and confirmed that the fence had indeed been built on her property without permission. The confirmation brought a sense of relief, as if a weight she hadn't fully realized she was carrying had been lifted. Once the legal aspect was clear, she spoke with her neighbor again, this time with evidence in hand. She explained that the fence needed to be moved within a specific distance according to property regulations, and that failure to comply would require formal enforcement. He listened quietly, without argument. For the first time, she noticed a slight hesitation in his voice. "I didn't realize it was on your property," he said softly. "I only meant to help. I will have it adjusted." Her relief was tempered with caution. She had learned that his calm, polite exterior could hide intentions that disregarded her consent. She remained firm, making sure the timeline for adjustment was clear and documented. Over the next few days, she watched as the fence was carefully moved, now properly aligned along the property line. Workers followed her instructions precisely, and she felt a small but satisfying sense of victory. It wasn't just about the fence. It was about reclaiming her autonomy, proving to herself that she could protect her home and her choices, even as the physical barrier was corrected. The psychological work continued. She reinforced her boundaries with the neighbor in subtle, everyday ways. When he offered help, she politely declined. When he asked questions about her routine, she responded briefly, without detail. When he appeared unannounced, she reminded herself that she did not have to engage beyond what felt comfortable. Each small action strengthened her sense of control and safety. There were moments of tension, of course. He would sometimes linger near the edge of his yard, watching her quietly, as if testing whether she would let him back into her space. But she remained calm and consistent, never wavering in her expectations. She had learned that firmness, combined with politeness, was the most effective way to maintain her boundaries without creating unnecessary conflict. As the days turned into weeks, a new balance began to emerge. The fence, now correctly positioned, became simply a boundary rather than a symbol of control. Her garden thrived again, and she could enjoy her yard without the constant unease that had shadowed her every step. The neighbor, while still polite, had adjusted his behavior. Keeping a respectful distance and refraining from overstepping, she reflected on the experience. Understanding that the lessons she had learned went beyond property lines, she had discovered her own strength, her ability to assert herself, and the importance of clarity and documentation. She realized that trust could be manipulated, but it could also be reinforced with boundaries and consistent actions. One afternoon, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, she watched the sun cast golden light over the garden. The flowers she had planted with care swayed gently in the breeze, and for the first time in weeks, she felt completely at ease in her own space. She realized that autonomy was not just about physical boundaries. It was about having control over decisions, feeling secure in one's choices, and knowing that no one could impose their will without consent. She began to rebuild her routines, allowing herself to enjoy the small pleasures of her home again. Morning coffee in the garden, arranging flowers, reading books on the porch. Each act was now hers fully, unshadowed by the fear of unsolicited interference. Over time, she even noticed small changes in the neighbor's behavior. He no longer offered unsolicited help, no longer lingered with questions or observations. Their interactions became neutral, polite but distant, a reflection of the boundaries she had established. She realized that change was possible, even in people who had previously overstepped. As long as boundaries were clear and consistently enforced, the experience left her wiser, more confident and more attuned to her own needs. She understood that appearances could be deceiving, that someone who seemed kind and helpful could have intentions that did not align with her autonomy. But she also understood that she had the power to protect herself, to assert her rights, and to reclaim her space. No matter how small or subtle the encroachments might be, friends and neighbors who learned about the situation praised her for handling it calmly and effectively. They admired her patience, her careful planning, and her courage in confronting the issue without escalating conflict unnecessarily. Her experience became a quiet lesson in the importance of boundaries, self-respect, and vigilance in everyday life. One evening, she walked through her garden, feeling the sun warm her shoulders and listening to the gentle rustle of leaves. She paused near the edge of the property, looking at the fence, now correctly aligned and neutral. It was no longer a symbol of control, but a reminder of her journey, her strength, and the careful steps she had taken to protect her home and herself. She realized that the world would always have challenges, that people might act in ways that overstep boundaries, and that trust could sometimes be misused. But she also knew that she had learned how to respond, calmly, firmly, and wisely. She had discovered that her voice mattered, her decisions mattered, and her space mattered by the time evening fell, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. She felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in weeks. Her home, her garden, and her life were hers again. She had faced uncertainty, subtle manipulation, and the discomfort of having her trust tested, and she had emerged stronger and more self-assured. As she sipped her tea and watched the fading light, she smiled quietly to herself. The fence had been a test, and she had passed it. She had learned the importance of boundaries, the power of assertiveness, and the value of clarity in all interactions. Her home was safe, her space was respected, and she felt a sense of triumph that came not from confrontation, but from careful planning, patience, and steadfast determination. And so, life returned to its peaceful rhythm. The garden thrived, the sun rose and set, and the neighbor's presence became a neutral part of the landscape. She had learned that safety, comfort, and autonomy were not simply given. They were earned through awareness, courage, and consistent action. The fence remained, but it no longer carried tension or unease. Instead, it marked the boundary of a woman who had learned to trust her instincts, protect her space, and assert her rights without fear. And as she looked across her yard, smiling at the flowers, the trees, and the warmth of her home, she knew that she had reclaimed more than property. She had reclaimed her confidence, her peace, and her sense of self. Even after reclaiming her space and asserting her boundaries, she realized that life would not simply return to the calm days she had once taken for granted. The fence, while no longer a source of tension, had left a lasting impact. It had changed how she viewed her home, her privacy, and the people around her. She had learned valuable lessons about trust, assertiveness, and self-respect. But the experience had also opened her eyes to the subtle ways boundaries could be tested in everyday life. She spent the next few mornings walking through her garden, carefully observing everything. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, the trees cast soft shadows, and the sunlight touched the earth in warm, golden patches. Her hands brushed over the petals, feeling their delicate texture. She reminded herself that this space was hers, not just physically, but emotionally. Every inch of her yard, every flower, every piece of furniture represented choices she had made, decisions she had taken ownership of, even with the neighbor respecting the new boundaries. There were lingering moments that tested her patience and resolve. Sometimes she would notice him pausing at the edge of his yard, glancing toward her home. Other times, she would catch sight of him walking along the sidewalk across the street, seemingly observing the way she moved through her garden. These moments no longer filled her with fear, but a quiet vigilance settled in her mind. She had learned that awareness was necessary, even when the threat seemed minimal. One afternoon, she decided to make her garden even more private. She purchased additional plants, taller shrubs, and small trellises to create natural screens along the edges of her property. Each addition was deliberate, a combination of beauty and protection. She planted climbing flowers that would soon grow along the trellises, creating a living wall that added color while providing a sense of security. Every time she worked with soil, watered a plant, or pruned a branch, she felt a growing sense of control and satisfaction. The neighbor noticed the changes, but did not comment. For the first time, she realized that her actions spoke louder than words. She didn't need to explain herself, justify her choices, or seek approval. Her yard was her space, and the simple act of tending to it was a declaration of her autonomy. In the evenings, she spent more time reflecting on the weeks that had passed. The appearance of the fence had been the catalyst for a journey she hadn't anticipated, a journey of self-discovery, empowerment, and personal growth. She had learned that politeness and friendliness could be misinterpreted as consent, that small favors could be used to test limits, and that asserting boundaries required patience, clarity, and confidence. One particular evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the garden was bathed in warm, orange light, she sat on her porch with a notebook. She began writing about everything she had experienced, the subtle signs she had initially ignored, the unease that had slowly built, the steps she had taken to reclaim her home. Writing allowed her to process the emotions she had stored over the past weeks. She realized that each interaction with the neighbor had been a lesson in reading human behavior, understanding motives, and trusting her instincts. As she wrote, she felt a sense of gratitude mixed with relief. Gratitude for the clarity she had gained, relief that she had found the courage to assert herself, and pride in knowing that she had handled a difficult situation with composure and intelligence. She understood that her journey was not just about a fence, it was about understanding herself, recognizing her rights, and refusing to let subtle manipulation erode her sense of self.